Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Arlene Sachs, and this is Mark Strauss. Welcome, Mark. Mark is my guest today, and he's going to talk about from A to Zétény. Is that how you pronounce it?
That's how you pronounce it.
And how he got involved with genealogy and how he found this town, which is in some country.
Now it's in
Slovakia.
Now it's in Slovakia, but it was Hungary up until World War I.
That's the trouble with so many of these Eastern European places, is that the town didn't move, they became different countries.
Well, actually, it's in this town is now, since I've been researching, it's been in 3 different countries in the last 100 years.
I feel sorry for those people that lived there and they have to learn all these languages. So how did you get involved with genealogy to begin with?
Well, let me first say that I'm an architect and I'm a partner in a large firm called FX File in New York. And I also became president of the AIA in New York. And for years and years, I never had any time for hobbies or any time for research. But there was a period of time in 2008, as the economy was beginning to slow down, and I was no longer president of the AIA, that the first time in my life I would come home and I didn't have 1,000 emails to answer or deal with issues in the firm. And I would come home and my wife said I needed a hobby because she was concerned that I didn't know what to do with myself. So as a consequence, I started thinking about some interests that I had that I have never really followed through on. And one of them was an interest in genealogy. And it came from wanting to understand a little bit about both sides of my family. I had a little bit of knowledge on my mother's family because my grandfather, my mother talked about my grandfather. He had actually, my mother's father had fought in the Spanish-American War and won a Silver Star, and there was a whole story about him that we always knew about, and we knew that family very well. But my father's family, we knew very little about because my father had come over in the early 1900s with his sister and settled in Scranton, Pennsylvania. I mean, my grandfather had settled in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And we never talked about his family. We knew that they were Hungarian. My grandmother made great goulash and fricassee and all these Hungarian specialties. And my grandfather, who was in produce in Scranton, Louis Strauss, was at one point known as the Onion King of Scranton because he had the monopoly on all the onions coming in and out of Scranton. But we hardly knew much about the family where they came from. And it wasn't something that anybody talked about. And then in high school, we had a cousin come over from Israel, and his name was Avraham Strauss, which was my father was Alvin Strauss, and his Hebrew name was also Avraham. And it turned out that this guy was born on the exact same day as my father.
Interesting.
And they looked alike. My father was an electrical engineer. This guy was an electrician in Israel. And he came over and we took him to Scranton to meet other family members. And he told the story about where our family was from in this little town. How
did you know about him, or did your father know about him?
Well, he knew about us. I guess people knew of him.
Okay.
I didn't know of him until he arrived, and he arrived in New York, and my father brought him in, and he stayed with us, and then we took him to Scranton to meet other family members. At that point, my grandfather had been dead, but he met cousins who were still in Scranton. And he didn't speak English. He spoke German and Yiddish, and my father spoke a little German, and he was able to translate, and that's how we communicated. But he told about our family. He told about this town called Zétény, which was in Hungary, and how the entire family had been killed during the war, and that he was the only one who had been left in this town, or left in the area, and that as far as he knew, the rest of the family had died. So I was interested. I wrote down the name of the town, and he told a story that our great-grandfather had, and it was his grandfather who was also named Avraham. They were named after the same person.
Well, that's the common thing,
yeah.
is to name after somebody after they've died. So.
And Avraham was the son of, I later found out Berko or Bertrand was the sort of name in Hungary. And the family had an inn in this town for 200 years, and that's also something that I found was fairly common, because the Jews were allowed to distill spirits, and basically the Christians weren't, and the Jews were the ones who distilled the spirits, so they often had a little inn. They created, at this point it was some sort of schnapps.
Yeah, and they weren't allowed to own land too, so they were very limited in what they could do.
Yes, they were either peddlers or or innkeepers or something like that. And it also became a place, apparently, I guess, that as peddlers were traveling, Jewish peddlers, it was a place where they could stay, get a kosher meal, and communicate with others who were from the religion. And apparently this inn had been in the town for 200 years, that the Strauss family had been there until the 1700s, until they were all wiped out during the war. And so he told the story of this family, and I, at the time, I decided that I would write to the Czechoslovakian embassy to see if they had any information. And they wrote back saying that they said that the town is now Zétény, Czechoslovakia, not Zétény, Hungary, and for a fee that they would do some research or send me some information. And I was a little weary at the time. It was 1970. It was in the height of the Cold War. I wasn't sure I wanted to send money to Czechoslovakia, and I didn't want to. I was afraid if they found that there were some living family members in the area, it might get them in trouble. So I decided that it's best to sort of let things lie. And then in 2008, when I decided to start getting back into looking at family and information I had, I started a family tree, and I began on Ancestry. I now have a much larger one on myheritage.com, and I started documenting what I knew, and I did not know very much. I knew that the Strauss family, my grandfather was from Scranton, and I was able to get a subscription so I could look at the census information and some naturalization papers.
See, it was so much easier for you. You could do everything online.
Exactly, because the time I got into it, this information was there. And then I discovered jewishgen.org, and I was and where they started translating census records from Hungary. And slowly but surely, I built a tree that took my Strauss family back to the 1700s with the information I found as a combination of information I found on Ancestry, where the naturalization paper actually showed that my grandfather had come from Zétény, and it showed what ship he was on. It showed the name of his father, and with that information, then finding census information on jewishgen.org, I found a whole family, starting with the 1869 census of the Jews in Hungary, that actually listed this family, listed my great-grandfather. I then found even there's a trading association records that showed an advertisement that my great-grandfather had, as not only did he run this inn and sold schnapps and distilled liquor, he was also selling formal wear, which I guess had to do with weddings and things like that might have happened at the inn, so people could rent tuxedos. And apparently it also related to, there was a castle across the street from where this inn was, and the story that my cousin from Israel, Avraham, had told was the fact that kings and princes on their travels through Europe would often stay at this inn, which didn't make much sense because I didn't.
You'd think they'd stay at the castle.
Yeah, but probably what was happening is that the footmen and the people associated with the castle would probably stay across the street at this little inn, and there was some sort of relationship that occurred. But it all started making sense, and I was able to sort of find enough information that it served as a starting point.
Was Abram still alive?
Well, the thing is, by the time I got into it, my father had also died. I had no record of where Avraham was, and I never was able to reconnect with him to find out.
How old would he be now?
Well, both he and my father were born on the same day, which was in 1925. So they'd both be 90 degrees.
But there are ways to find people in Israel that the Israel Society can help you.
Well, I did do a search at one point, and I was not able to find it. And as I recalled, I don't think he had children. I don't think they were descendants. But I've since found other branches of this family that we've connected to somewhere in Israel, but we've not been able to. I've never been able to find out what happened to Avraham.
Yeah, because I know that there are people in Israel that do a lot to help you find people. And something aside, but a friend of mine, a very close friend from high school, her mother spoke Hungarian. She came in, I don't know what year, but she had a strong accent. I know she spoke Hungarian. And when my girlfriend started doing research, it's like, too, she says, it wasn't Hungary that she was born in. But, obviously her mother had always said spoke Hungarian, always said they were from Hungary. But
well, the fact that they came over, my grandfather came over before World War I, and he came over with one sister whose family also got into the produce business, and they worked together for a while. They saw themselves as Hungarian, and it didn't matter what happened to the borders. And this one town actually straddles the border. It's right on the border with Hungary, just over the border.
Okay, so.
And apparently this one part of the county during World War II was given back to Hungary when the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, was broken apart by the Nazis, and this area was given back. So the years that during World War II, it was actually part of Hungary again.
So it's hard to keep track of all of that. So how did you arrange your trip to go there?
Well,
when did you decide that you needed to go back there?
Well, in 2012, our oldest son, who's actually a filmmaker, communications major, went to American universities, living now in DC, but he was taking a semester off from American University, and not a semester off, a semester abroad, and was studying in Prague. So my wife and I decided to visit him in Prague, and as part of that, I said, well, listen, it's in the Czech Republic. I really want to go to Hungary, and I'd like to see this town where my family was from. And it wasn't just this town. My grandfather's, my grandmother, his wife, her family name was Berkovitz, and I had discovered through my research that they were from this area that's now known as Humani, or Humona, who used to be in Hungary, now Humenne, also in Slovakia, which was only about 45 minutes or 30 kilometers from Zétény. And I decided that why don't we take a trip? I'd like to see Budapest. We'd also go to Vienna and would go to Prague. But on the way, I'd like to go up and see these towns. And originally I was going to rent a car and travel on my own just to see what these places were like. And my wife was a little nervous.
Yeah, I would be too.
Rightfully so. And I said, okay, well, let me see if we can find a guide and figure out how we can do this without renting a car in places that I don't really know. So I went online and I just did some research on guides in this part of Slovakia. And also, we did a research that figured out if we were going to go up into this area by train to begin with, there were trains to Košice, which is the largest city in this eastern part of eastern part of Slovakia, and we were able to go to Košice and by train, and I found a guide that specialized in that area of Slovakia, had worked with Jewish families, but he didn't only work with Jewish families. And this guy, Michael Sir, we found him, and he met us at the hotel with his car, and we created this sort of loop trip that started in the north. We went around Humana and into the towns surrounding it, came back through Zétény, and then back to Košice, and we were actually able to do the whole trip in one day. We were able to arrange for it, and we had the most fulfilling day of my life. And our son, who was in Prague, actually took the train, met us there, and joined us for this trip. And then we all went back to Vienna and Prague, and we were all together for the remainder of the trip. And it was what was interesting, and I tell about this in the article that I had written in Avotenu and in this memoir, is that I had first found, in addition to finding records on the family and finding where this place was and doing research on the area, I had been corresponding with this woman, Betty Schemmel, who had written a book that talked about her family living in Hungary, and how her grandfather was from this town of Zétény. And she wrote a passage about going as a child to Zétény and being on the train and what that experience was like. And I had gotten her email and was corresponding with her, and she actually sent me copies of the memorials in this town as well as the adjacent town.
I think there was a picture of that.
And that showed Strauss names on the memorial. So one of the things that I wanted to do when I got to Zétény was actually find who these people were who were on the memorial and how we were related. And so when we got there, the guide talked to somebody as we entered the town and wanted to know if anybody had known of any Strauss members in the town, and somebody remembered the Strauss name and suggested that we go find the mayor of the town, and that he might have some records. And along the way to finding the mayor, we met up. We also heard that there was a Jewish cemetery outside of the town, and he directed us to somebody who might be able to show us where the Jewish cemetery was.
But you were really lucky because your guide hadn't done that research before, so he didn't know until you got to that town.
No. So he had actually tried to reach the mayor before we got there, and he never was able to get through. So all of this, we were very lucky, both here and even in Humana, where we found the old Jewish cemetery and names of Berkowitz's, which was my grandmother's name. We were able to find all that stuff in the stones in the cemetery. In this case, we couldn't get to the cemetery because it was over a river, it was over a ravine. We had to go this circuitous route to get there. But we were able to see it, and since then, the mayor sent us photographs of some of the stones.
Oh, okay, that was
and very nice. And also, they found some additional information about exactly where our family's inn was in this town, because we actually went to this little inn, this little tavern that was in the town, a different tavern, and I kept thinking maybe this was my family's tavern, and maybe I own this place if I wanted to, but it's not something that I necessarily wanted to do or explore, because frankly I think if one did own it, you'd probably be subsidizing the community.
As American, they expect something more of you. So you were able to find your family, and they actually had paper records. The mayor did, or?
Well, no, he didn't have. I was able to. They directed me to a census in Bratislava, some record group that actually had research on censuses. And,
you also mentioned this Zétény,
and this is the memoir that I had written on the family. And
I think they'll put that.
And I think you have some additional images of it. But one thing that was in this that came from my I don't know if you can see this.
I can't see that.
But there was actually a letter that I got that told who the Strausses were in the surrounding towns and and once I had that information and who their fathers were, I could then connect them to the census information that I had.
And they actually wrote to you in English?
They wrote to me in English. Yes, they did.
Very nice.
Yeah. So this was actually, and this was like the director of the Slovak National Archives wrote to me directly to give me this information. And I was able to correspond with him via email because I actually had gotten his email address, and he sent back this letter to us.
Well, it's amazing sometimes that the people are willing to help, but I think the generation that's helping genealogists now is not the generation that was caught in the Holocaust themselves. So I think they're more open to helping people and perhaps making up for what some of their families had done.
Well, that's what my wife and I had this discussion ourselves, because when I was over there and the mayor was so nice, they basically gave us these mugs with the name Zétény on them. They gave us we went to the bar and had a drink with them, a beer or whiskey, and then we had commented how nice these glasses were, and they forced us to take these beer glasses back with us, and I was actually also shocked at how nice and embracing the people were. But I also had reservations because I knew 70 years ago that the entire family was rounded up and taken away. And I wondered if one of the reasons that they might be so nice is that they might be afraid that we were coming back to take back property and possessions.
I've heard that too.
And that they might be interested in sort of, maybe they were told to be so nice as a way of assuaging that kind of people coming back and taking the property that might have once been theirs.
I've heard that too, and I've done research in Germany. I've had very nice people help me, and one time, it's a little bit off, but a professor in mine said to me when we were getting involved with Iraq, don't get involved with the war, and we've been through that. We don't want anybody to go through something like that again. I mean, she's the next generation down, so she was born well after the Holocaust, and I think some of these people have a guilt. And as you said, maybe they're coming back. You might be coming back to claim land and all of that. On the other hand, I think we just have to take it as face value and say thank you very much, and just be glad that you're able to get that information that you might want. So, what would you tell other people if they were planning a trip?
Well, I think it's really important to find a good guide. And if you and you need to sort of find the towns. Once you find the towns where your family was from, do a lot of research beforehand.
Did you use JewishGen as a source for looking for the guides? Because I think they have a listing of some of the guides that people have recommended.
I actually went on there I did a search on through their special interest groups to see if people talked about guides, and then reached out to some of those people who suggested some names and some sources. But in the end, because I wanted to go through Košice, I didn't find many that were listed there, and I but I did have like 3 or 4 names, some of which came through Jewish Gen, and the one that we found, I just found like an online through Google, an online reference to this guide in Slovakia, and I think they're either licensed or certified if you're going to be a guide. And there was a list of certified guides, and he was on this list.
Okay. Yeah, that's important, because when you're dealing with something online, you don't know that the guy could have written it up himself and really not know anything. We've found a guide that way once, not in Europe, but and we were very lucky. I felt that he was good, but you don't know, because it's blind. You're dealing with it blindly unless you have recommendations that you can find on.
And frankly, he did do some research beforehand. He actually got the original archival information, found my grandfather's birth certificate, the original copy of it, and had sent it to us. So he did do some research, but he didn't actually get to Zétény until the day that we had gotten there.
I don't know if you want to tell me this. How much did something like that cost? How much a day did you pay him?
I mean, my wife probably remembers this better than I do, but I think it wasn't more than like $100
that's a bargain for what they have to do. Then.
It was a whole day, and he drove us around. It was cheaper than if we had tried to rent a car and do it ourselves.
And if you try to rent a car, then you don't know where you're going. If you're lost, you can't ask any questions.
And one of the reasons that we also decided we needed to do this in one day is the towns that my family were from, the smaller towns. Khomeini was a little bigger. They didn't have even inns or places that you could stay.
Yeah.
So you sort of had to to sort of do this in a one day, or almost go back and then go back the second day.
Yeah. How many miles did you cover?
It was probably about. I would say it was about 100 miles in total.
Okay. Oh, well, that's really relatively close, even if your roads aren't.
But we would also stop in each of these places, and we had lunch and
But you were able to find inns or whatever to eat and things like that.
Well, we went into one larger community near the Ukraine border as we came out of Khomeini, which was on this like resort town. I forget the name of the town, but it had a beautiful hotel that looked out over the water, and we were actually, the whole trip, the day that we did it was Good Friday, and in Slovakia, and they had like this procession marching down to the water. It was very dramatic, and the funny thing is that when I had done research on the towns, I actually found some videos from Khomeini before the war, that through the Holocaust Museum, that showed similar parade on Good Friday when these people came to visit the town.
Well, thank you very much. It's been really interesting talking to you, and thank you for all the information you've given. And I hope maybe this will help somebody else who's trying to plan a trip.